The sign was always there, faded but unchanging. Free bicycle repairs in exchange for a good story. It hung crookedly above a small wooden workshop on the corner of Maple and Third. The paint peeled, the screws rusted, but the message remained day after day, season after season. And the man behind the sign? Old, old, quiet, always in a gray cap and oil-stained overalls. People called him Mr. Len, though few knew his real name, even fewer knew his past. But everyone who stopped by left with something more than a fixed chain or tightened brakes. They left feeling heard. One rainy Thursday afternoon, a girl appeared at the entrance, standing uncertainly with one foot on her worn-down pedal. She looked no older than 15. Her bike was almost too small for her, its paint chipped like old nail polish. The back tire sagged, clearly flat. Her backpack bulged with books, and her uniform shirt clung damp to her shoulders. Mr. Len looked up from the chain he was polishing. She hesitated before speaking. Excuse me? The sign says, "I fix bikes," he said, finishing her sentence with a small nod. "But only if you've got a story." She blinked. "A real one?" He gestured toward the wooden stool near the workbench. "They're all real to someone." With that, he crouched beside her bike and began inspecting the damage. She sat slowly, hugging her backpack like a shield. "I'm not sure if my story is good enough." He didn't look up. "You'd be surprised what makes a story good." She was quiet for a moment, the rain tapping gently on the tin roof above them. "My name's Marla," she said finally. He gave a small grunt of acknowledgement. "I want to be a writer," she continued. "Someday, but people laugh when I say that." Now he looked up. "Why?" "Because I'm just a kid from East Side, because my parents say I should be a nurse or a teacher, because no one they know has ever written a book." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like the beginning of a story to me." Marla hesitated. Then, encouraged by the stillness of the space, she spoke. "I started writing when I was 9. My first story was about a bird who couldn't sing, but she learned to write poems instead. I showed it to my teacher, and she said it was sweet, but she didn't really mean it, I could tell." Mr. Len wiped his hands on a cloth. "Sweet is better than nothing." Marla laughed softly. "I guess." She glanced around the workshop. It smelled like grease and old wood. Hanging from the ceiling were dozens of bike wheels, like halos suspended midair. A black and white photo of a young woman rested above the tool shelf, her smile frozen in time. "Is she your wife?" Marla asked. He followed her gaze. "Was." There was silence after that, not uncomfortable, just quiet. "I don't show my stories to anyone anymore," Marla said, breaking it. "I just write them in my notebook. At lunch, in the bathroom at school, even on the bus." "Then they're still alive," he said. She tilted her head. "Stories don't need readers to exist," he explained, "but they do need someone who cares enough to keep telling them." Marla smiled at that. He finished tightening the last bolt and stood. "Try it now." She mounted the bike, wobbling slightly as she tested the repaired tire. It rolled smoothly, like it had remembered how to breathe. "That's amazing," she grinned. He simply nodded. She was about to ride off when something made her stop. "I have something for you," she said, digging into her backpack. She pulled out a small spiral notebook, its cover bent, its edges worn. "This has some of my stories, the ones I haven't finished yet." She offered it to him with both hands. "I want you to have it," she said. Mr. Len didn't move at first. Then, with a strange gentleness, he accepted the notebook like it was something fragile. "I'll take good care of it." She smiled wide. "Thanks for listening." And with that, she pedaled away, the rain finally softening into a mist. That night, after closing the workshop and turning off the lights, Mr. Len sat under the glow of a single desk lamp. He opened the notebook. The handwriting was messy, enthusiastic, full of scratched out lines and stars in the margins. One story was about a girl who could talk to shadows, another about a boy who collected forgotten dreams. He read until the pages blurred. When he closed the book, he sat quietly for a long time. Then he got up, walked to the shelf behind him, and opened an old metal box. Inside were other notebooks, letters, drawings, a folded paper airplane. He placed Marla's notebook inside. Another soul, another story. Another reminder that he was still needed, not for his tools, not for his skill, but for the simple act of listening. And as the clock ticked into the early morning, Mr. Lenz smiled. Because somewhere out there, a girl named Marla was riding her bike home, maybe thinking that just maybe her stories mattered. And he knew they did. The morning after the rain always smelled like something trying to begin again. Mr. Len was already at his workbench, wiping the dew off the rusted vise when he heard the unmistakable crunch of tires rolling over gravel. He didn't look up, not right away. He liked letting people arrive at their own pace. The man was in his early 30s, tall but slightly hunched, as if the world had given him more than he knew how to carry. His jeans were too loose around the waist, his flannel shirt creased from too many nights of being slept in. His bike was a sorry thing, the kind of machine that had been ridden hard and cared for little. The chain dangled loose, red with rust. The handlebars squeaked even when still. "Your sign," the man said, voice dry. "Is that for real?" Mr. Len didn't turn around. "You got a story?" The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "I've got a dozen, but they're not the kind you'd want to hear." Len finally looked up, meeting the man's tired eyes. "Try me." The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Can't hurt." He rolled the bike forward and sat on the bench beside the shop. Mr. Len knelt beside the back wheel, inspecting the chain. "What's your name?" the old man asked. "Tyler." "And the story?" Tyler let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "I got fired 3 weeks ago, worked at a warehouse downtown, 8 years straight, never late, never missed a shift." Mr. Len reached for a rag, beginning to wipe the chain clean. "They said they were cutting costs, downsizing, whatever word makes it sound less like they just didn't care anymore." He laughed again. This time it cracked a little. "I haven't told my mom. She still thinks I'm waking up early for work. So I get on this piece of junk every morning and ride around until she leaves for her shift at the diner." Len nodded, not judging. "Job hunting?" he asked simply. Tyler shrugged. "Tried, but every place wants someone younger, or someone with a degree, or someone who doesn't look like he's already lost." And silence settled between them like an old blanket. "I used to be proud, Tyler said, of being the guy people could count on. I paid our bills, bought Mom a new stove last Christmas. I didn't think it would all vanish in one conversation." Mr. Len didn't speak. He just kept working, oiling, straightening, adjusting. His movements were slow, deliberate. There was something sacred about the way he treated broken things. "I've thought about leaving," Tyler continued. "Just riding somewhere far, anywhere. Maybe sleep in the woods, vanish for a while. Nobody would miss me." At that, Len paused. "Someone would." Tyler looked over, surprised. "You think so?" Len stood up, wiping his hands. "I know so." He reached behind the bench, pulled out a small metal tin, and opened it. Inside were dozens of tiny scraps of paper, notes, receipts, torn corners of newspapers. He pulled one out and handed it to Tyler. Tyler unfolded it, puzzled. The handwriting was shaky but careful. "To the man who fixed my brakes and helped me breathe again. I didn't tell you, but that day I was on my way to end everything. Your kindness changed my mind." Tyler looked up, stunned. Len returned to his tools. People think fixing bikes is simple, but sometimes it's the small things that keep people going. Tyler sat quietly, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "I didn't come here for a pep talk," he muttered. "Good," Len said. "I'm too old for speeches." They both laughed, just a little, but enough to break the tension. "Chain's fixed," Len added. "Tighten the brakes, too. You'll want to replace the back tire soon." Tyler nodded slowly, standing up. He reached into his pocket instinctively, pulling out a few crumpled bills. Len held up his hand. "No money. But, just leave a story." Tyler hesitated. Then, after a moment, he took out a pen from his shirt pocket and turned the back of the scrap paper over. He wrote something, folded it, and placed it gently into the tin. As he mounted his bike, he turned back. "Thanks," he said softer this time. "For what?" "For not making me feel like I'm broken." Len gave him a small salute, then watched as Tyler rode off, his back a little straighter than before. That night, after locking up the workshop, Mr. Len sat by his tiny desk lamp, just like he always did. He opened the tin, took out the folded paper, and read the words Tyler had left behind. "Still unemployed, still scared, but today I rode home with hope instead of shame. Maybe that's a start." Len smiled. Another soul, another chain repaired. And as he placed the paper gently with the others, he whispered to no one in particular, "That's more than a start, kid. That's a ride worth taking." The wind carried the scent of autumn that morning, dry leaves, chimney smoke, and a quiet sadness that only the changing seasons seemed to understand. Mr. Len opened the workshop early that day. There were no customers waiting, but he didn't mind. He liked the stillness before the world rushed in. He swept the floor slowly, listening to the soft creak of the old ceiling fan above. Then he poured himself a cup of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just as he always had since his wife passed. He had just settled onto his stool when the bell above the door gave a soft, uncertain jingle. It wasn't a child this time, nor a man with tired eyes. It was a woman. She walked slowly, deliberately, her coat neatly buttoned, her boots spotless, despite the damp sidewalk outside. But what caught his attention most was the bright red scarf wrapped around her neck. A bold color for someone with such a gentle presence. Her hair was snow white, tucked behind her ears, and her eyes, they were searching for something. Not a service, not a fix, something else. "Are you Mr. Len?" she asked, voice soft but clear. He gave a small nod. "I was told that you trade repairs for stories." He gestured to the empty stool by the counter. She sat down carefully, adjusting the scarf as she settled in. "I don't have a bike," she began. "At least not one that works anymore." Mr. Len didn't speak. He simply reached for a small cloth and began polishing a wrench, giving her space. The woman gave a short breath, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. "My name is Margaret, but people used to call me Maggie." She paused, then added, "I think I came here to remember who that was." Mr. Len glanced up, but said nothing. She took the silence as permission to continue. "I used to ride bikes everywhere when I was younger. You wouldn't believe it now, but I was fast. My brother used to tie me around the block. Said I flew like a bird that forgot it wasn't meant to touch the ski." Her smile faded just slightly. "I stopped riding after the war, after my brother didn't come home." Mr. Len's hand slowed its motion over the wrench. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, but her voice trembled slightly. "He left me his bike. Said he wanted me to keep flying for both of us. I tried, I did, for years. But eventually the world got heavier. I got slower. The chain rusted. The tires deflated. And one day I put the bike in the shed and never touched it again." She looked at him then. but I couldn't throw it away. He nodded gently, because it still carried him. She blinked, surprised at how perfectly he understood. Yes, she whispered, exactly. He set the wrench down. Where's the bike now? In my car, she said, it's barely holding together. He walked with her to the curb where a small hatchback sat idling. In the trunk, under an old blanket, was a vintage road bike, once beautiful, now almost skeletal. The red paint had faded into rust orange. The seat was torn. The chain sagged like it had forgotten how to hold on. But Mr. Len touched it with the same reverence he gave every story he repaired. They wheeled it into the shop together. As he worked, scrubbing rust, tightening spokes, oiling the joints, she continued her story. He was younger than me, you know. Everyone thought I'd be the one going off to war. I was fearless, reckless even, but he enlisted the second he turned 18. Said someone had to be the brave one. She smiled faintly. Turns out I was only brave because he was always behind me. The work was slow, but meaningful. They didn't fill every silence with words. Sometimes Maggie simply watched his hands move, as if each repair was a memory being restored. After nearly 2 hours, the bike stood taller, shinier, not new. No, Mr. Len didn't believe in erasing the past, but whole, respected, loved again. Maggie walked around it slowly, eyes glistening. I thought it was beyond saving. Mr. Len shook his head. Nothing that carried love ever is. She touched the handlebars gently. Then, without warning, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth. It was a handkerchief, soft, embroidered, old. I found this the day my brother left, she said. It was tucked in the bike's basket. I think he meant to take it with him, but forgot. I kept it ever since. She placed it in the basket now. Maybe it's time it went riding again. She turned to him, tears quietly trailing down her cheek. Thank you, she whispered, not just for the repairs, but for letting me be Maggie again. He simply nodded. As she wheeled the bike out of the shop, the red scarf fluttered behind her, bright against the gray sky. And for a moment, Mr. Len could almost hear two sets of laughter echoing down the street, one present, one past, both flying again. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Mr. Len opened his tin box. He didn't add anything to it this time. Instead, he reached in and pulled out a photo. It was old, curled at the edges, a picture of himself and another man in uniform. Younger days, long gone. He smiled at the memory. Sometimes stories didn't need to be written down. Sometimes they lived on in red scarves, rusted bikes, and the sound of wheels turning after decades of stillness. The summer sun returned like a warm apology after a long week of rain. It touched the metal tools in Mr. Len's workshop, casting golden glints across every surface. Outside, the breeze carried laughter from the nearby park. Children playing, tires rolling, life happening. Mr. Len sat at his usual spot behind the counter, sipping his second cup of black coffee. The wooden sign above the door swayed gently. Free bicycle repairs in exchange for a good story. It had become more than a motto. It was a quiet invitation, a silent bell calling out to the broken, the drifting, and the quietly hopeful. That morning, around 10, the bell above the door gave a sharp, unfamiliar jingle. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, lean, with sun-touched skin and wide, curious eyes. A camera hung from his neck. A small map was folded into his back pocket. His clothes, though clean, had the creases of someone who'd been on the move for days. He gave a small bow and wheeled in a bike, sleek, modern, European. The back tire had clearly hit something sharp. It wobbled, deflated and sad. Mr. Len nodded. The traveler looked around, noticed the sign, and gave a sheepish smile. Then he pointed to himself, touched his lips, and shook his head. He couldn't speak English. Mr. Len raised one eyebrow. No English? The man shrugged and gave a polite smile, pressing his hands together as if in apology. There was a moment of quiet. Then Mr. Len stood and pointed at the bike. Problem, he said slowly, gesturing to the flat tire. The traveler nodded quickly. We. Story? Len asked, tapping the sign gently. The traveler tilted his head. Len thought for a second, then tapped his chest. Me, story? He held out his hand. You? The man seemed to understand. He opened his backpack and pulled out a small leather sketchbook. With a few quick strokes of a pencil, he began to draw. Mr. Len watched. In under a minute, the man held up the paper. It showed a tiny caricature of himself. Mr. Len with his cap, a bike tire in one hand, a wrench in the other. Behind him, a faded sign with crooked letters. Len laughed. The man turned the page and drew again. This time, a small village. Stone streets, a house with ivy crawling up the side. A tiny boy riding a bike beside an older man with a large nose and mustache. He pointed at the boy, then at himself. Ah, Len said, your grandfather. The man smiled wide and nodded. Another drawing. A plane. Then the Eiffel Tower. A suitcase. A stamp. Then the same boy, now grown, standing in front of landmarks. Big Ben. A gondola in Venice. A pagoda. The traveler placed his hand over his heart, then pointed to the bike. It wasn't just transportation. It was part of his journey, his way of seeing the world. Len's hands slowed over the repair. He glanced at the man and saw something familiar. The hunger to connect, the ache to be understood, even when words fell short. The repair didn't take long. A patch, a pump, a test ride, done in 15 minutes. But the traveler didn't leave right away. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small metal tin. Inside were folded pieces of colored paper. He unfolded one, bright blue, you saw, and carefully began to shape it. It was origami. Len watched as the paper twisted, folded, transformed. In under a minute, a tiny paper bicycle sat on the counter. The traveler gently placed it on the shelf behind Len's workbench, next to a collection of small tokens, a cinnamon bread recipe, a girl's notebook, a faded army patch. Then he bowed. Len bowed in return. They stood there for a moment, two men from different continents, different languages, different lives, bound for a moment by the silence between them and the story that didn't need to be spoken. As the traveler wheeled his bike toward the door, he paused. Then he turned, lifted his camera, and gestured for a photo. Len gave a small, rare smile. Click. The man nodded once, then walked outside and disappeared into the sunlight, his tires whispering across the pavement. That evening, as shadows stretched across the wooden floor, Mr. Len sat alone. He picked up the paper bicycle and turned it in his hand. So small, so delicate, yet somehow full of motion. He placed it gently beside the other offerings. And as he turned off the lights, he whispered something into the quiet. Some stories speak without sound. The heat arrived quietly that morning, not the burning kind, but the kind that settled on the skin like a sigh. The sun slanted through the cracked window of the workshop, painting stripes of gold across the wooden floor. Mr. Len wiped his hands on a rag and took a sip from his chip mug. The world outside stirred lazily, as if even time was running a bit late. The bell above the door jingled, sharply, impatiently. She came in like a gust of wind, mid-30s, hair pulled back in a messy knot, cell phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes scanned the workshop while her mouth moved at 100 miles per hour. I told you I'll be there by 2. Yes, I have the report. No, I didn't forget. I said I'm dealing with it. She paused, lowered the phone, and glanced at Mr. Lin. You fix bikes? He nodded slowly. She pointed out the door. Flat tire, back wheel. Can you do it fast? I'm in a bit of a rush. Mr. Lin tilted his head toward the sign above the door. Free bicycle repairs, in exchange for a good story. She blinked, then frowned. What is this, some kind of performance art? He didn't reply, just stood and walked past her, stepping into the heat. The bike was parked carelessly by the curb. A child's seat attached to the back. The tire was indeed flat, worn, neglected. He wheeled it into the shop without a word. She followed, still on the phone, still pacing. Yes, I'll email it when I get home. No, I don't need an extension. I just need 5 minutes to... Ugh, hold on. She hung up abruptly and turned to him. Okay, look, I don't have time for a story. I've got work, a toddler, a daycare bill due tomorrow, and a deadline that was yesterday. Just please, can you fix the tire? I'll pay double. Mr. Lin didn't answer. He crouched beside the bike and began inspecting the rim. She let out a frustrated sigh, pacing again. I used to ride this bike for fun, you know. Sundays in the park, before I had my son, before my husband and I. She stopped herself. Before everything got so complicated. Mr. Lin said nothing. But now, she continued, now I ride it to drop him off at daycare, then rush to work, then pick him up, then cook, clean, maybe answer a few more emails before passing out at 2 a.m. and doing it all over again. She crossed her arms, as if bracing against her own words. I don't have time to think or feel or tell stories. He stood up slowly and pointed to the stool near the counter. She hesitated, then sat. The silence stretched. I used to write poetry, she said suddenly, as if surprised by her own voice. In college, I'd stay up late scribbling on napkins, dreaming about publishing a book someday. She gave a soft, bitter laugh. Now the only thing I write is grocery lists and apology emails. Mr. Lin nodded gently. She kept going as if something had broken open. I snapped at my son this morning. He wanted to show me something he drew, and I told him I didn't have time. And then he looked at me with these big eyes, like I just stepped on his heart. She wiped her cheek quickly. I hate that. I hate that he sees me like this, always rushed, always tired, like I'm never really there. Mr. Lin quietly removed the old tube from the tire, replacing it with a fresh one. He's only 4, she whispered, and I'm already teaching him that love has to wait. She looked at the bike, at the child's seat. He loves that bike, says it feels like flying when we go downhill. I used to laugh when he said that. Now I just nod, check my watch, and tell him to hold on tight. Mr. Lin didn't interrupt. He just kept working, like the rhythm of his hands was pulling her story to the surface. I don't even know why I stopped in here, she said softer now. I was going to walk the bike home, maybe figure it out later, but something about the sign, I don't know. He tightened the final bolt and stood. All done. She reached into her purse instinctively, then stopped. Instead, she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a child's drawing. It was messy, colorful, joyful. A woman on a red bicycle with a boy behind her, arms spread wide like airplane wings. She stared at it for a long moment, then handed it to him. He drew this last week, said it was his favorite day. Mr. Lin accepted it gently. I think I needed to remember that, she said, that even if I'm not perfect, even if I'm late and overwhelmed and exhausted, to him, I'm still the woman on the bike who makes him feel like he's flying. She smiled for real this time. then stood, dusted off her jeans, and wheeled the bike to the door. Before leaving, she turned back. I don't know if that counts as a story. Mr. Len smiled, placing the drawing into his tin box. It counts. She laughed. Thank you for fixing the tire and for letting me stop. As she pedaled away, the child's seat bounced gently with the rhythm of the road. Empty for now, but waiting. And inside the shop, Mr. Lin looked at the drawing once more. Crayon lines, skewed proportions, but full of heart. A boy, a bike, a mother who didn't know she was still someone's hero. He placed the drawing gently beside the others. Proof that even when life moves too fast, there are still moments, however brief, that remind us to breathe, to feel, to remember, and maybe even to fly. The morning began with the sound of sparrows, tiny chirps, slicing through the quiet like gentle reminders that life was still unfolding, minute by minute. Mr. Len was rearranging tools on his bench when he heard the bell above the door jingle softly. Not the sharp ring of an adult in a hurry, but the uncertain tinkle of someone small, hesitant. He looked up. Standing in the doorway was a boy, no older than 7, freckles, grass-stained sneakers, a striped helmet too big for his head. Behind him was a red bicycle, a child-sized one, the kind with a colorful bell on the handlebars and stickers peeling off the frame. The boy didn't speak right away. He shuffled inside, holding something in both hands. It was a tiny silver bicycle bell, broken clean off. "Is this the place where you fix things?" he asked, voice soft. Mr. Len nodded slowly. "If they want to be fixed." The boy blinked. "This one really does." Len gestured to the stool. "You got a story for me." The boy climbed up, legs dangling. He looked down at the bell, turning it in his fingers like it was something sacred. "My name's Caleb, and this bell," he held it up, "was from my dad." Len didn't interrupt. "He gave me this bike last summer, said every good explorer needs a good ride and a loud bell. He said it was the law of adventurers." Caleb smiled for a second, then it slipped away. "But then he had to go for a really long work trip. He said it would only be a few months, but it's been a whole year now." He swallowed hard. "My mom says he's in a place that doesn't have phones or letters. But I think it's more serious than that." Len crouched beside the bike, inspecting the empty spot where the bell once lived. "I ride the bike every day," Caleb continued. "Even when it rains. I ring the bell when I pass our old picnic bench. That's where he used to sit and clap when I went really fast." Len reached for a screwdriver. "But then last week, I crashed." The boy's voice grew smaller. "I was going too fast, and the bell flew off. I couldn't find it at first. I thought it was gone forever. But then I saw it in the grass, all bent and sad." He placed the bell on the counter like a wounded friend. "I tried to fix it myself with glue and tape and hope." He looked at Mr. Lin. "But I think it needs someone who really knows how to fix things." Len studied the bell. It was indeed bent, the internal chime loose, the clamp broken. But he didn't say that. Instead, he said, "I've fixed tougher." Caleb watched as the old man went to work. It took longer than usual. Len wanted to be careful, not just with the bell, but with the memory inside it. While he worked, Caleb roamed the workshop. He looked at the old photographs, the tools, the paper bike from the traveler, the cinnamon bread recipe, the crayon drawing from the little boy in the child seat. He returned to the counter with wide eyes. "Is this your memory box?" Len paused, then nodded. "Cool," Caleb said, reverent. 10 minutes later, the bell chimed again, gently, clearly. Caleb gasped. "You fixed it!" Len smiled. "It's ready to adventure again." The boy attached it back to the handlebar, twisting it with careful hands. He pressed it once. Ding! It echoed through the shop like a celebration. Then, without thinking, Caleb stepped forward and hugged the old man's waist. "Thank you," he whispered. "Now he'll hear me again." Len froze for a moment, then slowly placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Before leaving, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a map I drew," he said proudly. "It shows all the places I have explored on my bike. You can keep it, just in case you ever forget where to find adventures." He handed it over. Handed it over, then hopped on his bike, and with one last ding, he sped off down the street, cape flapping in the wind, wheels turning like the world was still full of magic. Mr. Len stood at the doorway, watching until the boy was just a speck. Then he turned, opened the tin box, and placed the map inside, between the stories, the letters, the memories. Proof that even the smallest bell, when fixed, can ring loud enough to echo love across the silence of missing. And that sometimes the bravest adventurer is just a boy trying to be heard by someone he still believes can hear him. It started with a drizzle, a soft tapping against the workshop's old tin roof, like fingertips gently brushing the memory of a forgotten song. Mr. Len looked up from his bench. The street outside was empty, clouds pressed low against the rooftops, the kind of gray that makes everything, even time, feel slower. He stood, moved to the window, and watched the rain gather on the glass in trembling rivulets. Then, as if summoned by the quiet, the bell above the door gave a soft jingle. A woman stood in the doorway, older. Her raincoat was damp, her umbrella dripping. She had a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder and eyes that looked like they'd once held joy, but had misplaced it somewhere along the way. Mr. Len gestured to the stool. She hesitated. "I don't have a bike," she said. "Is that still okay?" He nodded. She walked in, water trailing behind her, and sat down with a careful sigh. "My name's Helen," she said. He said nothing, just offered her a towel for her hands. "I used to live 2 blocks from here," she said, "when I was young, before the world started pulling me away." She looked around, taking in the familiar scents, grease, oil, and something older, deeper. "My father used to bring me here," she continued. "Not to this shop, but to the corner. There used to be a bakery where this place stands. Every Saturday, we'd ride our bikes together. Me on my pink Schwinn, him on an old rusted thing with a squeaky wheel." She smiled, then caught herself. "He always got cinnamon rolls. I hated them, but I'd pretend to love them just to make him happy." Mr. Len raised an eyebrow. "You hate cinnamon rolls?" She laughed, surprised by her own honesty. "With a passion." He chuckled, softly, then gestured toward the rain. "What brings you back today?" Her face grew more serious. "My dad passed away last month." The room seemed to quiet even more. "I went through his things, and I found this." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a photo. 2 people on bikes, a man with a thick mustache and a crooked smile, and a girl with wild curls and knees scraped from adventure. "He kept it all these years," she said, "even after we stopped riding, even after I moved away and stopped calling so often." She traced the edge of the photo with her finger. "I was supposed to visit him last fall, but work got busy. Then Christmas came, then spring. I kept saying soon, but soon ran out." Her voice broke on the last word. Mr. Len reached into the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out 2 mugs. He poured tea, the herbal kind his wife once loved. Helen accepted the cup with both hands, like it was warmth itself. "I rode past today out of habit," she said. "I wasn't going to stop, but then the rain and your sign." She looked up at it again. "Free bicycle repairs in exchange for a good story." "It's funny," she said. "I used to think stories were for people who did big things, climbed mountains, saved lives, changed the world." She looked back at the photo. But now I think maybe stories are what we leave behind when everything else is gone. She handed him the picture. I don't know if it counts, but it's the only one I have left. Mr. Len studied it carefully. It counts? She smiled. Then from her bag, she pulled out a small, rusty bell, old-fashioned, the kind that jingled softly instead of ringing. This was on his bike, she said. Still works somehow. Would you, would you mind adding it to your shelf? He nodded, taking it gently. As she stood to leave, the rain thickened outside. A steady curtain now. She looked at him, eyes full of something unspoken. Thank you, she whispered, for letting memories live a little longer. She disappeared into the storm, the umbrella bobbing away down the street. Mr. Len sat for a long while. Then he placed the bell on the shelf beside the paper bicycle, the crayon drawing, and the cinnamon bread recipe. Next to them, he leaned the photo of the man with the mustache and the wild-haired girl. He listened. To the rain, to the silence it filled, to the echo of bike wheels and laughter long gone. And when he finally sipped his tea, it was just warm enough to remind him that even on a rainy afternoon, kindness could be the light that refused to go out. It was the kind of morning that smelled like fresh bread and second chances. Mr. Len had just unlocked the shop and flipped the sign to open when he noticed something strange. There was a bicycle sitting outside, not chained, not parked neatly, just left. It was new, too new for this neighborhood. Clean frame, shiny gears, expensive. He stepped outside and looked around. No one in sight. Then he noticed a folded envelope taped to the handlebars. For the man I once stole from. His hands paused mid-reach. He remembered suddenly a summer afternoon 3 years ago. The workshop had been full of sunlight and open windows. He'd stepped into the back room for no more than 5 minutes. When he returned, the bike leaning near the counter, a donation from a regular customer, was gone. So was a set of tools. He hadn't said anything. Not to the police, not to the neighbors, just a quiet note to himself. Sometimes people take what they think they need more than you do. Now that same space held a gift, a return perhaps, or maybe a beginning. He took the letter inside and opened it with careful hands. The handwriting was messy, like it belonged to someone who hadn't written in a long time. Dear Mr. Len, 3 years ago I stole from you. I was 17, angry, broke. I thought the world owed me something, that no one cared. And then I saw your sign, free repairs for a good story, and I thought, what a joke. I didn't have a story, just hunger, just fear. So I took what I could and ran. I didn't think about what it meant to take from someone who made without asking anything in return. I didn't think about what it cost you. But I've thought about it every day since, especially when I landed in juvie. And especially when, by some strange twist, I ended up in a youth rehab program that taught kids how to repair bikes. Full circle, right? They had us read stories, your kind of stories. Stories about second chances, stories about people who listen. One of those stories, I swear it was about you. The man with the shop on the corner, the sign, the quiet smile. I don't know if you even remember me, but I remember you. And that terrifies me, because sometimes the people we steal from end up owning a piece of us forever. So here's a bike. It's clean, it's yours. I saved for months, fixed it myself. But more than that, here's my name, Jordan Ruiz. The kid who took and who's trying now to give back. Mr. Len read the letter twice, then a third time. He folded it carefully, like it might fall apart if touched too roughly. Then he opened his tin box and placed it inside. Beside the map drawn by a little boy, the cinnamon recipe, the paper bike, the bell. each one a redemption, a reminder. He walked back outside and stood beside the donated bike. It was a good build, strong, the seat adjusted perfectly, tires pumped just right. Whoever Jordan had become, he'd become someone who paid attention. Mr. Len wheeled the bike inside. He wouldn't sell it, wouldn't keep it. He'd wait for the right kid, the one who walked in with a story written in their eyes, not yet in words. The one who needed not just a ride, but the feeling of moving forward. That afternoon the rain returned. Not heavy, just a steady hum. Mr. Len sat behind the counter, a cup of tea in one hand, Jordan's letter resting beside it. He didn't say anything, but if someone had asked him what hope looked like, he might have pointed to the bike in the corner, or the drawer full of letters, or maybe just to the sign above the door that still hung crooked, still waiting. It had been a quiet week. The shop felt emptier than usual, with no bikes lined up outside and no customers bustling in for repairs or stories. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung heavy, like a promise unfulfilled. Mr. Len sat by the window, his hands resting on the counter. The small clock on the wall ticked steadily, the only sound breaking the silence. He watched the street outside, the occasional car, the shuffle of pedestrians, the routine of life carrying on without a second thought. The old wooden sign above the door swayed in the light breeze. Free bicycle repairs. In exchange for a good story. It had become a part of him, a part of this corner of the world. The bench beside the sign had also become a fixture, not just a place to sit, but a place to rest, to think, to wait. Over the years, it had seen many faces, people coming, people going. Some came for repairs, others simply sat. The bench had a way of inviting people to stay, even if only for a few minutes, even if only to breathe. That day, as Mr. Len wiped down his tools, he noticed an elderly woman slowly making her way toward the bench. She was thin, her back hunched slightly with age, but her steps were steady. She had a gentle grace about her, as though time had only made her more thoughtful, more deliberate. She didn't look like she was in need of anything, and yet she sat down on the bench. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she gazed at the sign as if she were reading it for the first time. Her eyes softened as she took in the simple words, as though they held more weight than they appeared. Mr. Len watched her from inside the shop. He didn't approach right away. He knew that sometimes people needed a little time to gather their thoughts, to prepare themselves to speak. He waited. It wasn't long before the woman stood, slowly making her way to the door. She hesitated for a moment, glancing inside the workshop. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. "I don't need a repair," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Mr. Len set down the wrench he'd been holding and gave her a nod. "I'm just here to talk." She smiled faintly. "You don't mind, do you?" He gestured to the stool beside him, welcoming her in. She sat down slowly, folding her hands on her lap. "I used to bring my husband here," she said after a moment, "years ago when we lived down the street. He loved this little shop. He was always tinkering with things, bikes, radios, old furniture, anything that needed fixing." Mr. Len listened quietly. "He passed away a few years ago," she continued. "We had a good life. We didn't need much, just each other." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment the silence between them felt like a space that had been unspoken for far too long. "We used to walk down here every Saturday. He'd bring me coffee and we'd sit on the bench out front. He would tell me stories about his day, about the people he met. He liked hearing about their lives, their troubles, their joys." She paused and glanced toward the window. "I don't know why I'm here today," she said, almost as if to herself. "I guess I just wanted to sit where we used to sit, to remember what it felt like." Mr. Len nodded. He didn't speak, just let the quiet fill the space between them. I don't have any stories left to tell, she continued softly. He took all the stories with him. Mr. Len looked at her, his eyes gentle. You still have your story, he said quietly. She met his gaze, a slight surprise in her eyes. I'm not sure I do, she said, her voice faltering. You do, Mr. Len said. Your story isn't over yet. The bench is still here. The sign is still here. And the stories that others leave behind, they're still here too, waiting to be told. She looked at the bench again, and for a moment her eyes softened, as if the weight of the years had lifted just a little. You're right, she said, nodding slowly. Maybe it's not too late for a new story. Mr. Len smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but a quiet one that came from understanding. He watched as she stood, her back a little straighter than before. I'll come back, she said, turning toward the door. Maybe next time, I'll have a story to share. As she stepped out into the street, Mr. Len watched her take a slow, deliberate breath, as if she had left something heavy behind and was finally ready to walk forward. She paused for a moment at the corner, glanced back at the bench, then walked off down the street, her pace steady but lighter. Mr. Len stood at the window for a long while after she had gone, the shop still and quiet around him. He didn't go to the bench. He didn't need to, because the bench wasn't just a place to sit. It was a place where people came to remember, to reflect, and sometimes to begin again. It had seen many stories, and it would see many more. The sun had set, leaving a soft orange glow in the sky, and the street outside Mr. Len's shop was quieter than usual. The evening air had a cool crispness, a sign that autumn was creeping in. Yet, inside the workshop, time seemed to slow down, as if it were waiting for something. Mr. Len had closed up early that day. The shop was empty, but the bench outside was still waiting, as it always had been. He sat at his counter, the same counter where countless stories had been shared, and thought about how much had changed in the years since he'd opened his doors. The sign still hung, weathered and crooked. Free bicycle repairs in exchange for a good story. And though there were fewer stories now, fewer visitors, he knew that something had changed inside him. He felt the weight of time more acutely now, and yet he no longer felt the heaviness of regret that had once followed him. The bell above the door jingled softly, and he looked up. A figure stood in the doorway, framed by the dimming light outside. It was a man, a young man. He stepped in cautiously, as if unsure whether he was in the right place. I heard about your shop, he said. His voice was hesitant, but there was something about his presence that felt familiar. I've never been here before. Mr. Len nodded. You've come to the right place. The man glanced at the sign, then at Len. He seemed to hesitate before speaking again. Are you still doing repairs? I mean, I don't need anything fixed, but His voice trailed off, unsure. Len gestured to the stool, inviting the man to sit. You don't need a repair, you need a story. The man sat down slowly, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes lingered on the shelves filled with small mementos, drawings, letters, photos, and the bikes that had come and gone. I don't have a story, he said finally, his voice quiet. You do, Len replied, smiling softly. Everyone has a story. The man looked at him, searching his face for any hint of sarcasm, but found none. He glanced down at his hands, fidgeting slightly. I've been running away from mine for a long time, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Len waited. He had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the best way to invite someone to speak. I lost my father when I was young, the man continued, his voice cracking slightly. And my mom, well, she did not know how to be both mom and dad. I tried to take care of her, but I don't think I ever really could. I guess I wasn't good at it. He paused, running his hands through his hair. I started moving around, never really settled. College, job, city, city, city. Always somewhere else. I thought I could outrun what I felt, what I lost. But no matter how far I went, I always felt it, the emptiness. Len nodded gently, his eyes understanding. Then one day, the man continued, I found myself at a crossroads. I was tired of running, tired of pretending to be okay. I knew I had to do something different, and that's when I heard about your shop. My grandmother used to live near here, and she always talked about your sign, about how you listened. She said he's the one who listens when the world doesn't. I never really understood it until now. The man looked up at Len, his eyes filled with something close to desperation. I don't know why I'm telling you this. I don't know what you can do to fix me. Len smiled gently, then stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the empty bench. It's not about fixing, son. It's about listening. Everyone needs someone to listen, even when they think their story's over. The man looked up, puzzled. You see that bench outside? Len continued. That bench has heard hundreds of stories. Some were happy, some were sad, some didn't have an ending. But every person who sat there left something behind. They didn't come for the repairs. They came because they wanted to be heard. The man stood slowly, following Len's gaze to the bench outside. A long moment of silence passed between them. I never got to tell my father goodbye, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. And I never told my mother how much I appreciated her. I guess I thought time would give me the chance to say those things. Len turned back to him. Maybe you're not meant to say goodbye yet, he said softly. Maybe you're just meant to start a new chapter. The man's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't wipe them away. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than the weight of the past. Len reached behind the counter and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He handed it to the man. Write it down, Len said. Write the story you're running from. Write it for yourself, then let it go. The man took the notebook, his hand shaking slightly. I don't know if I can. It's too much. Len smiled again. You can. Everyone can. Sometimes the best way to let go is to write it down. The man nodded slowly, and for the first time he felt like he was standing on the edge of something new. He left the shop quietly, the notebook tucked under his arm. As he stepped outside, the sun had fully set, and the street was quiet. The bench sat there waiting as it always had. Mr. Len watched him go, then turned back to the counter, his heart a little lighter. Because he knew the stories didn't end. They never did. They just kept being written. And sometimes the best repairs were the ones that could only be made by letting someone speak, by listening, and by remembering that the end was just the beginning of something new.